Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. If you are new to the show, please smash that subscribe button. Also consider becoming a YouTube member, a Patreon, or donate small amount given in the link in the description box. But the least you could do is to watch this show, like, share, and comment. Without further ado, let me welcome our guest tonight, Arnold August. Arnold is a Canadian author, journalist, and political analyst based in Montreal, Quebec. He has written extensively for outlets like Global Times, Monthly Review, and has authored several books, including Cuba and Its Neighbors, Democracy in Motion. Last year and this year, he traveled through Xizang, which is another name of Tibet, documenting some of the things he saw there. Today, we will be talking about his experience in China. Arnold, welcome to India and Global Left.
Thank you very much for having me, Joe Xizang.
I want to talk about what you saw in Tibet, in particular in China. But if we could start with the whole Western propaganda about China in general, but how Tibet has been very central to it since 1959. So if you could start with why the West is so concerned about China and what is the role of Tibet in building this propaganda and information war against China?
I thank you very much for having me on the show, Joe Xizang. I think that question is very pertinent. China has been developing so much over the last few decades that even the West has to acknowledge these advances. The amazing modernization that has been going on in China, the fact that, and even the World Bank admits it, that from 1978 on, in a short period of time, China lifted 800 million people out of extreme poverty. This is an amazing historic landmark, not only for China, for the world. So the basic narrative is that, well, China has accomplished all of these things, but at what cost? And then if you try to argue in favor of China, they will say, well, what about Tibet? Of course, the implication is that there is, discrimination against the people in Tibet and in the neighboring province of Tibet, where many Tibetans live. Now, I went to China. I knew quite a bit about China and about that area before, but I was pleasantly surprised to see how the Chinese have been able to link modernization, development in that area at the same time, not only preserving, as I saw, actually promoting culture, literature, language, religion of the Tibetan people.
We will come back to some of the things about modernization and preservation of culture. But if we could start with 1959 itself, because quite often than not, we know that this was started by CIA and it has been taken up ad nauseum by the Western propaganda, that 1959 represented this quote-unquote moment of Chinese invasion of Tibet, while the reality is that it was the great moment of emancipation of serfdom in the region. So if you could tell us really about the significance of 1959 and integration of Tibet into the Chinese Socialist project, I think that would be great setting up the context for our future discussion, further discussion.
Yes, that is an excellent context. In fact, on March 28, 1959, after many, many centuries of serfdom, which is a form of slavery as bad as feudalism in Europe or worse, after all these centuries, because of the unification of Tibet and the help of the Chinese government and Chinese Communist Party, finally serfdom was abolished on March 28, 1959, a historic moment. However, as you hinted at, not everyone in Tibet was happy with that. On the contrary, those who profited from the system over many centuries, being serf owners or higher up people in the theocracy, they decided to wage an armed struggle against these advances. And despite the wishes of the vast majority of the Tibetan people, I mean, who would want to remain as a serf when the opportunity is there to abolish serfdom? However, this revolt, which was fomented by the U.S., and pushed forward by the United States was defeated. So what happened there? The Dalai Lama, who was CI sponsored right from the beginning, was forced to admit defeat, and then he fled to India, where he is residing now in India as an illegitimate pretender to be a leader of Tibet. That is a significant of March 59. Of course, we could talk about it later. It's still spilling over now because as the Dalai Lama has just turned 90 years old a few months ago, the Prime Minister of India, Modi, sent a congratulatory message to the Dalai Lama on that occasion a few months ago, and the Chinese reacted quite strongly. They sent a note, a diplomatic note to Prime Minister Modi saying, look, as you know, the issue of Tibet is up to the Tibetan people, the people in that area of Xizang, and the current holder of the post of Dalai Lama is not how the succession takes place. And he politely said in the diplomatic way, don't interfere in the internal affairs of China, nor in the internal affairs of Tibet, because the successor to the Dalai Lama is historically and traditionally carried out by the Tibetan people themselves in conjunction with the Communist Party of China and the government of China. So this is an ongoing story. And, when the Dalai Lama passes away, I guess this will come to the news once again. But that is the basic context. The main thing was that China brought people out of feudalism, out of serfdom, and has developed so much. I mean, it's just recently in this year, China is celebrating the 60 years of the Xizang establishment of the autonomous region. And just in that period of time, from 1965, when it was established, a long time ago, 60 years ago, till 2024, the per capita income has increased manyfold. The life expectancy went from 35 to 72. And there are so many other examples. For example, the number of schools went from 1,828 schools in 1965 to currently 3,600. So these are some of the major advances that have been going on in that region since the autonomous region was established 60 years ago.
Overthrow of feudalism and building up of human capital, education, health. These were landmark achievements of Mao's China. But I want to also come to post-reform China, and one of the spectacular achievements of that second phase of socialism in China, if you like, is the modernization project. Post-reform China looks very different from Maoist China in the sense that infrastructure has completely changed, and it looks like China pretty much looks like the West. But Tibet is quite much more spectacular in the sense that it is ecologically much more fragile, if I could use that word. And Chinese leadership acknowledges that balance, if you like, between ecology and development. So if you could tell us about what you saw in terms of China's modernization project in Xizang, in Tibet, and how they have tried to balance these two responsibilities of ecology on one hand and development on the other hand, I think that would be great.
Yes. Firstly, I think that's an important point, providing the historical context. In 1947, India became independent, right? In 1949, the next couple of years later, China's revolution succeeded. Now, at that time, the GDP, the overall GDP and the economy was very similar between India and China. However, since the opening, which you mentioned, that took place later on in the Chinese Revolution, the situation has completely changed by opening up, by modernizing, by using all of the funds that the Chinese government collects in the sale of services and goods domestically and internationally. It's plowed back into the economy. And a massive modernization has taken place since that time, and leaving India far behind. And, so there's an important, I'm very much interested in India, and it opens a question of, which role should India take in the future with regards to the betterment of its people. Now, with regards to the environment, there are many places that we saw in Xizang, and saw how even in that remote area, very difficult access, the Chinese government, in collaboration with the local authorities of the autonomous region of that area of Xizang, they are building, for example, specific important sources of hydroelectricity, clean power. And we saw enormous um, panels, modern panels to conduct electricity to substitute from the type of electricity that is fostered by coal and other material which is not conducive to the environment. And I also saw examples of how they preserve the wetlands, etc. So the Chinese people, contrary to what is said in the Western media, are very concerned about the environment and everything that they do in China. And we saw that in Xizang as well. Everything that they do, without exception, is to take into account the environmental aspects on the Chinese people. And, it was so refreshing to go on that train trip of 2,000 miles for 22 hours from the neighboring Qinghai province to Xizang, and we saw the expansive areas there of yak roaming around, beautiful scenery. All this remains intact, and even in the outlying areas, for example, in Lhasa itself, we saw how the authorities there make sure that the atmosphere and the environment remains intact in Lhasa itself as a city.
I want to come to this again, Western trope of cultural invasion or cultural eradication, whatever term you like, which is stuck to Tibet. Of course, as you mentioned in your earlier answer, that in Tibet, feudalism, the monastery was entangled with feudalism. So part of that clergy and ecclesiastical order was hooked into the landed class, the elites. And the Chinese Revolution, of course, broke the bones of that social structure. But that was twisted and presented as a case of cultural eradication. We have the whole context of invasion of Han Chinese, which is, I think, it doesn't make sense, but I think the rhetoric is more robust in the case of Xinjiang, given there is a much longer history of actual immigration from the mainland into the region. But we have seen these rhetorics. So if you could tell us a little bit about how does the local culture appear to you when you are traveling there as a foreigner? Does it look like an ordinary mainland city or mainland region, or did you also see specificities that tell you quite the contrary to what the Western picture about Tibet is?
I like that question a lot. It provides me an opportunity I will present two examples. One is the institutions that we saw in Lhasa, cultural and other institutions. And secondly, a boarding school that we visited, because the so-called, what you're saying, the cultural genocide, supposedly according to the West, takes place in the boarding school. So I will deal with both. Let me deal with the first thing, the question of the institutions. In Lhasa itself, we visited about 5 or 6 different institutions. University of Tibet, another museum that houses manuscripts going back thousands and thousands of years of Tibetan history, society, etc. And for example, the University of Tibet, the language is Tibetan. And there's also another institute that deals with the overall, the manuscripts and documents going back to thousands and thousands of years of Tibetan history for everyone to see. Now, in these institutions and museums, like the actual seed of the Tibetan soul its origin, its religion, its thinking and philosophy is not only preserved, it's promoted. So the question I ask for those, is sort of a challenge from those in the West who point to China as, carrying out a cultural genocide. Now, if China wanted to carry out cultural genocide in Tibet, the first thing they'd have to do, we know from history, right? They would have to eradicate the seeds of the cultural history, the religion, and language of the Tibetan people. But the opposite has taken place. In all of the institutes that we visited, we see first and foremost the promotion of these institutes, its language, the culture. Now, there's one of the main narratives that we see very often, it comes up from time to time, is that, China has, evolved so much, but what about the boarding schools, what they call the cultural genocide in the boarding school? Well, I visited a boarding school in not in Xizang as such, but in the neighboring province of Qinghai, which is very heavily Tibetan populated. Now we visited this boarding school. All of the students there were Tibetan. Okay. Now what we saw there was amazing. I mean, I was a bit amazed. I was expecting something very good, but it's much better than I expected. Firstly, it's a beautiful school. What are the language being taught there? In order of importance: Tibetan, Han, and Chinese, as well as history, politics, geography, science, sports, etc. All of the major subjects that we're familiar with in the West, but the number one on the agenda is the Tibetan language and its history, of course. So that was very, very important visit there, and the quality of the boarding school is phenomenal, because I know we have boarding schools, in which the native peoples, the original native peoples of Canada and the United States, were put in residential schools. That was cultural genocide. If you want an example, go to Canada and the United States and the cultural genocide against the native peoples there. Now, in that school, for example, they have beautiful dorms, 4 dorms, 4 beds per dormitory. And they even thought, that area is quite cold. So in order for the comfort of the students, the floors are gas heated, just to give you one example. And there's a beautiful cafeteria of 2 floors that can house 1,200 students at the same time. And we saw the menu there. We saw the food. I mean, many people in the West, working class people in the West, such as Canada and the United States, their kids will envy very much to have this type of meal at lunch during a school. They don't. However, in that boarding school, they do have it. And so the boarding school example is really one of a very important refutation of the false charge of cultural genocide. It's completely false. But of course, this hasn't stopped the United States and Canada and other countries from leveling this charge against China. But it's up to us who visit that area to make sure that the truth of the boarding school is maintained. In that context, I was, how the Tibetan language has evolved. I did some research, and everyone in Tibet, in that area, and a neighboring area, everyone 100% speak Tibetan. Now, in Canada and the United States, the native populations in our area, the average number of people who can speak their original native tongue, guess how much that is? Around 5%. So there is a 5%, that's cultural genocide, to 100% speaking the language. So, of course, this is one of the many false narratives, lies that we have to face. And that is one of the reasons that myself and other people travel to China, to tell the truth about the situation in China.
And this struck you even as you come from Quebec, which has a very distinct set of heritage from the French tradition and which has been surrounded by this anglicized seas, if you like, isn't it?
Yes, in fact, I wrote an article on that. I guess you're referring to that. Coming from Quebec, French speaking, our culture, our language, history, poetry, more recently film, it goes back to the 17th century from people who immigrated from France to Quebec. So you have that, history, that tradition. We have our own cinema, our own cinema, poetry, novels, nonfiction, singers, music, etc., which is Québécois, which is Quebec. Okay. Now, unfortunately, despite the attempts of the Canadian and Quebec government to protect this tradition, this heritage of Quebec, we are inundated. I don't want to use any dirty words. So we are inundated by American stars, okay, American personalities, singers and all. It's a continuous flow. We can't, there's no end to it. Taylor Swift, et cetera, et cetera. How do they get into Canada? First of all, everyone in Canada has access to CNN. So we get it from CNN and other programs which are dedicated to cultural promotion. And then even the Canadian media is so slavish that they also promote these American stars. So all our poets, musicians, personalities, etc., were just sort of a footnote in the daily ongoing struggle to maintain our own cultural heritage. That's why going to Tibet, I saw this was the opposite. This is what we need in Canada. We need definite legislation to support and promote Quebec culture. And sure, people might not like it called dictatorial, but curtail the invasion by the Anglo-American cultural invasion into our country.
And how did religion strike you in Tibet? And I'm asking this question because of a complicated history. Of course, part of the confrontation about religion and the Chinese state is propaganda. Of course, it's wrong and propagandistic to say that in China people have absolutely no religion or freedom. But part of it is also a long history in China about the conflict between the state and the religious orders, which didn't start with the socialist revolution, which actually goes back to the Qing state, but it really escalated after the 1898 reforms in China, when the project of modernization, for which land was basically needed and schools had to be rebuilt, collided with the ecclesiastical order's right to land, and that's how it proceeded. And of course, there were ups and downs during the Great Leap Forward and Cultural Revolution. It was escalated in many parts, but post-reform China, we see a lot of those relaxations, including boom of tourism, which also needs these traditions, and also the whole tradition of preserving and modernizing museums and culture in China. If you could tell us a little bit about how did religion in particular strike you in Tibet, given all this hasbara about religion in China in the West?
Yes, I wasn't expecting so much, but walking around the streets in Lhasa, I hope I'm giving you the taste to visit that area yourself at one point. Walking around the street in Lhasa, what we see in the main are people dressed up in religious costume. There are a lot of Buddhist monks walking around there. They're also carrying out prayers right in the center of Lhasa. And so there's, and we visit the important Lhasa monument there that is dedicated to religion. And when we went back to Beijing later on, we visited a major Lhasa Buddhist institute in that city as well. So we see people praying in the area with their beads and carrying out their rituals, etc. And so as the opposite of what people are saying, there may have been some conflicts initially, as you may have said, but this has been ironed out, where you have the full free participation of the people to exercise their religion. We've seen that all over the place. And people are proud to show this. At the same time, in Lhasa, we also see the modern Lhasa, the younger generation, people on skateboards, and some of them approaching us to speak with us, practicing their English. So everywhere we saw people practicing their religion in the street, in the monasteries, etc. So right now, it is flourishing, and I would have to say that the Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party, and the local authorities in that area in Xizang are responsible for allowing and encouraging religion to flourish in that area.
Let us zoom out a little bit and try to place Tibet at the center of the Chinese Socialist Revolution or the Chinese Revolution within Tibet. I'm very curious reading some of the things you have written. I found that you have also made this point that, which many of us have been making, is that China has been remarkably successful in kind of integrating the opposites, if you like. So, markets and state, a harmonic integration and combination and balance of the two, public and private, traditions and science, if you like, accumulation and redistribution. And we can go on and on about these careful combinations of these opposites, apparent opposites, if you like. In this context, how would you define Tibet today, as you saw it as an outsider, of course, in the larger scheme of things that the Chinese Socialist Revolution is going towards?
That in fact is a very important historical issue, the so-called supposed contradiction between the individual and collective. So I was pleasantly surprised when we visit a small entrepreneur tech station not far from Lhasa, the capital. And there we saw something very interesting. I mean, it hit me specifically. We saw, first of all, in order to get into that tech institute, all the person needs is a computer. That's all. And then they apply online to get into that tech center, which supplies all of the offices, etc., and the connections. Now, in order to apply and get into it, they also have to agree to the following. That is, to support the People's Republic of China, the Communist Party of China, and the goal of socialism. Chinese socialism, socialism with Chinese characteristic. That is part of the entry permission that they have to agree with. Now, some people in the West, oh, that's controlled by the state. That's terrible. The collective takes over, and the individual has no initiative. Well, what I found there was the opposite. It's a very, as you hinted at, it's an excellent example of all places in the world in Tibet that just recently, relatively recently in history, came out of serfdom. There you have it right in front of us. An example how China is dealing with successfully, in my view, that historical contradiction between the collective on the one hand and the individual, the state and the individual. Now, so these young people in the main go into that school. They have this agreement that they will develop their own talent, their own initiative. At the same time, it has to be in favor of the modernization and the goal of socialism in China. So we have this one example is that some of the students there are a very small startup group. They actually invented a drone that is specifically applicable and needed to the mountainous areas of agriculture in Tibet. So with this drone, the farmers are able now, with this type of invention, use this drone to fertilize the area, to carry out other important functions to develop the crops there. And it also helps to sort of like a GPS to sort of have a good overview of the mountainous areas. This way, they're able to increase their production, therefore increase their sales in the market and increase their income. Now, so this is a very good example, in my view, how you have that historical contradiction. Collective and individual. The state is there with this entrepreneurship entity right in Lhasa. The individuals go there and they can develop their own talent. So they have the satisfaction of inventing a drone that can help their fellow Tibetan people in the mountainous areas. At the same time, have a very good, solid income as a result of the sale of these drones to the farmers. So, I mean, it's sort of a twist of history. Tibet being the most, perhaps you can say, the most backward area before 1951, being a feudal society, a serf society, whereby 95% of the people were serfs and 5% were the serf owners and the theocrats. Only, 50, 60, 70 years ago. And right there we see in China, you have an example of socialism with Chinese characteristics, China in collaboration, the central government and the local leadership, solving this historical problem in this particular area of making individual and collective compatible. In my view, socialism, the state, and individual initiatives are not inconsistent. In fact, they help each other. The state is there to help develop, encourage individual initiative, and the individual initiative, when led by such a government as we have in China, contributes to the modernization and the development of socialism China. It was a great experience. I was never expecting to see a model of socialism with Chinese characteristics in Tibet, in an area that just came out of feudalism.
Of course. I have been I haven't been to Xizang. I have been to the mainland many times, and this January I'm going to Hong Kong, China, for another 3 months. And I have been quite struck and impressed by how China has been able to combine these aspects of modernity but also along with preserving their traditions. So in China, I don't feel like being in an alien place when I, let's say, live in Chicago or many parts of the US because of how unsafe the place is. And I know I'm using the phrase unsafe very carefully given how the politics has shifted in the West, about criminality, about immigrations and so on. But China has been able to combine these aspects, so we don't find the inconveniences of living in a global South country like India on the one hand, but we also don't feel the lack of sense of community. We have been discussing this question mostly among people in the global south about how can the rest of the global south, what can they learn from China. But I want to actually change the question a little bit, given you are from the west, and I want to ask you, given China has actually learned so much from the west and has improvised to improve the life of their own people, but the West is refusing to actually appreciate China and learn anything from China. Given your experience in China as someone from the West, what would you say that West can actually learn from China to improve its own difficulty that it is facing right now?
Well, I think one thing that the West can learn from China is to follow the Chinese example of learning from the West. I mentioned that railroad that went, 2,000 kilometers at a height about half the height of Mount Everest. It was an amazing engineering feat. There was 2,000 doctors who participated there to make sure that the workers were not harmed because of lack of oxygen and other issues. Now that railroad, it stands out as an excellent example of what can be done. But in order to do, it was a very difficult thing to do. They had to build it, for example, on permafrost, meant that there's a certain layer of, under the main earth that is frozen permanently throughout the year. What did they do in China? They went to Alaska to see how the people in Alaska try to deal with this problem of permafrost, dealing with transportation in Alaska. And the other thing that was very interesting in that railroad saga that I keep on repeating because I think it's very important was that, because of the very long distance, of course, they only had one track. So that created a problem. In order to avoid accident, what did they do to make sure the communication was so good between the trains coming and going that there was no accident? They went to Germany, in a city there which has a huge, railway area where many trains conglomerate in the same railroad station area. And they use that type of communication adapted to China in order to make sure that it is applied to the Chinese railway system. So that is the first thing I would say. It's ironic to, learn from China. One has to learn, one of the things one has to learn is how China learns from others. I mean, in my exchange with Chinese comrades and journalism and all that, the exchange is so smooth. I write articles for Chinese outlets. I propose articles. They get back to me with their view, and we come out with an article that is fitting and all that. So you have this mutual respect, me from the West and them from China. A powerful socialist country. So I think that's the first thing that people in the West has to learn. Is China far from what is being said that China is overbearing and all that. China is very, very modest. They have developed so much, and all they are saying to the world is, don't follow us. What we want is mutual collaboration, mutual exchange between the two of us. And there's an interesting story I like to tell with regards to China's, miracle of solving the problem of the historical problem of individual versus collective, is that in Venezuela, a country which I follow very much, the president of Venezuela about 6 or 7 months ago said they are adopting the Chinese model. That is how to combine the collective and the individual, the state and the individual. And I think I think that applies to any country in the world, that in the West as well. If people are looking for a new way out, yes, I think the China model is a good model to follow, not to copy, because the Chinese would be the first to say, you can't copy us. I agree, we can't copy. But that model of combining state and individual, the importance of modernization. That is really important. When I went to China the first time in 2003, a long time ago, I was amazed. I was expecting, something new, but I was amazed in 2003 when on arriving there about the infrastructure in China. That was back in 2003, how modern it was. And this is, supposedly a third world country. And from 2003 to 2025 now, it's developed even more. And, it's not just in the big cities. In smaller cities, it's also developing. The modernization is also taking place. I'd like to give you one example to highlight this thing. When I was there in my first trip in 2003, I wanted to see a typical rural village. So the guide there took us to a typical rural village. Okay. And as we walked through the village, he said, you can tell by the houses who is rich and who is poor. That was it back in 2003. So now I'm planning another trip, and I contacted the guide, and I said, I would like to go back to that same village to see what has happened there. How was it modernized? Did poverty alleviation take place there? We said, well, no, you don't want to go to that village. It's no longer a typical modern village. It's been completely modernized. I said, well, that's the point. I want to go back, from 2003, 2026, whenever I can go there. The difference that takes place even in the rural areas with regards to modernization. And contrary to what is said, it's not just in the big cities. It's also in the countryside. There's so many videos online how the Chinese have created miracles in small areas. In their villages, and to uplift people from extreme poverty and develop a very sound local economy. So I think this is a very important thing for people to learn about China.
You made such an excellent point about learning from China, about how to learn from the outside world. If I could even add a footnote there, is that learn from the outside world, but also add your own innovation. So China, as you would know, have engaged very directly with Western institutions, even like the IMF, but it doesn't accept all that is told to them. So it selectively accepts, let's say, reduction of tariff, but it selectively does not accept total decontrol of its capital markets. Just to give you one example, but and that's what I think leads to this, what they call as socialism with Chinese character. I have been quite struck in China by its people's curiosity, and I'm not even talking about people in the government, but people at large, their curiosity about the outside world. And I had a little bit of misunderstanding about this before I visited China, given I knew how big China is, and given I knew that most people would not know English, and given how everything is available in China within China. But I was remarkable. I was quite struck by how curious Chinese people are about the rest of the world. They are politically quite curious. They are, in terms of ideas, they are quite open. And as you said, the Chinese people are very modest. They are strong. They have become more and more confident, but they are extremely modest and curious. And I think the rest of us, the rest of the world, should definitely learn from that. Arnold, if I could end by asking you about to describe a little bit, as someone from the left, the hostility we find in the West, even among sections of the left, on the Chinese system. But I also want to include places like Cuba, Venezuela in the single question, given Venezuela has literally been under tremendous siege recently. I mean, it has been under siege, tremendous sanctions, propaganda, war, amassing marine troops. But President Trump has really escalated in various forms, including blowing up its boats and now the Nobel Prize. So if you could tell us or end this discussion by sharing your thoughts from your experience as leftists engaging with fellow leftists from the West, this hostility about actually existing socialist states, I think that would be a good ending.
Yeah, that's an excellent issue. You sparked my interest or my need to say something important. As someone from the left, I'm a follower of Lenin. And amongst other things, Lenin pointed out a long time ago regarding social democrats. They're socialist in words, but imperialists in deeds. He was so right. This way, with that guideline, I'm just a humble follower of Lenin. Soon as Mamdani, the new star of the U.S. left in the United States, who's running for mayor, soon as I saw his comments, his opportunists wiggling around on the issue of Palestine, he sooner or later he had to come out with statements saying he considers at the time when the United States is trying to invade or provoke Venezuela and Cuba at that very time in New York City, he said, well, and there's a dictatorship in Cuba and Venezuela. So as someone from the left, that's my issue. I think that, yes, open imperialism is terrible. But I think this example here, these social imperialists, socialists in words and imperialists in deed, are very, very important because they infect the political culture, the thinking of the people in their respective countries. And I think that the same thing with regards to China. Many of these social imperialists, they have, their issue. Oh, China is, is a state control. The media is state controlled, etc. in China. All of these, normal, narratives which are not based on reality at all. I mean, I deal with the Chinese press a lot. The way they write, they're so balanced, and they very are, as you mentioned, very much interested in have views of foreigners. And now many, many people in China speak English. So we can have this direct contact between us as foreigners and them as Chinese. And I think that, the important lesson to bring home is people should not believe what the West and their social imperialist allies say about China, Venezuela, Cuba, etc. That this is a real disaster to fall into that trap that, hitting against these countries from the so-called left.
We'll leave it there, Arnold. This was a fascinating conversation. We didn't get to discuss your work on Cuba, Venezuela, but that's not necessarily a bad thing, given that keeps the door open for our successive future invitations. Thank you so much for your time, and this was a real honor to have you on.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have two requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.